Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal, Canada for Reason to Resist on February 26, 2026. Today, we're very pleased to be joined for the first time by Arnold August. Today, Arnold and I will discuss the ongoing U.S. wars of imperialism against Cuba, Venezuela, and other Latin American states. Arnold is an author, independent journalist, and political analyst. He has an MA in political science from McGill University, Montreal, where he and I both reside and are currently situated. His books include Cuba and Its Neighbours, Democracy in Motion, and Cuba-U.S. Relations, Obama and Beyond. Since 1997, Arnold has spent extended periods in Cuba pursuing his intensive investigations in the region. Thank you very much for joining us today, Arnold.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, Arnold, before we begin, I just want to remind our audience that if they find this video to be informative, please like and share it. And if you're not already a subscriber to Reason to Resist, we warmly encourage you to become one. Please help us to expand the reach of our unapologetic resistance journalism. So, Arnold, I'd like to begin with Cuba. Cuba's government just announced that it has thwarted, it says, an attempt by armed exiles traveling on a Florida-registered speedboat to infiltrate Cuba's sovereign territory. And up on the screen here, you can see an article just published by The Guardian, which repeats but doesn't necessarily affirm the claims of the Cuban government. Arnold, I guess my question to you is, in your opinion, have we just witnessed a mini Bay of Pigs?
Yes, in fact, I was going to introduce that issue with that particular caveat. It's another small Bay of Pigs. Like that article you're showing gives us an overview, but in fact, based on my investigation, what the Cubans have said, and we have every reason to believe what they are saying, that boat was within 1 nautical kilometer of the central Cuban state of Villa Clara. That boat, which had on board 10 individuals, plus telescopic lens, rifles, handguns, as well as material to make Molotov cocktails, camouflage uniforms, etc. They are the ones who fired on the Cuban Coast Guards within 1 kilometer of Cuba, and of course they injured one of the commanders of the Cuban Coast Guard, and thus in self-defense they shot back. And of the 10 people on board, 4 of them were killed and 6 were wounded. Well, it's interesting, what happened to those 6 who were wounded? Did Cuba do as the United States did when they fired on the fisherman's boat in the Caribbean? And in one occasion, they killed everyone except 2 or 3. And those who were alive and clinging onto the boat, asking for help, United States exercised a double tap and killed them as well. Did Cuba do that? No, on the contrary. They took those wounded American, or based in America, they took them back to Cuba to have probably the best medical care that is available in that part of the world, if not in the world. And thus, this is basically what has happened there. Of course, the United States is trying to spin it in order to justify their own aggressive actions against Cuba. I just got an interesting report from one of my colleagues in Cuba. He was interviewed by an American TV broadcaster regarding that, and he gave his basic, facts similar to what I am giving now. But when that program was aired on TV, they cut out his interview. So, Rubio said on the 26th or on the 25th in the evening from St. Kitts that he is not sure who is behind it. He denied that the United States is behind it. At the same time, it's obvious, giving that one example, how they cut out the information from our colleague in Cuba who gave some facts about the case. The main thing is the United States is going to use it for their own purpose in order to try to continue or increase their aggressive activities against Cuba.
Mm-hmm. So Arnold, I put up the map here. You said Santa Clara. Is this the area to the southwest of the Bahamas between Havana
It's
and
actually the state of Villa Clara is on the north central part of Cuba, halfway between, say, Havana and Sancti Spiritus, according to your map.
right. So it would be yeah, about it would be more or less due southwest from the Bahamas on the northern
Exactly.
coast. Right.
And what is important, within 1 kilometer, 1 nautical kilometer of Cuba, and you, as an international lawyer, you know that that is in Cuban waters. I think, if correct me if I'm wrong, I think that every country has 14 nautical kilometers to consider as their own. But in this case, they came within 1 kilometer of Cuba.
Right. Now, this was clearly, if it was 1 kilometer, it's clearly within the territorial waters of Cuba.
Right.
Um, Now, what I guess what makes this quite apart from the claims coming from little narco Rubio, who uh, can't be trusted to tell the truth about anything relating to a sovereign Latin American state. Um, you know, the United States has been the military has been extraordinarily aggressive about policing maritime traffic
Uh,
to and from Cuba. So the idea, I mean, they've been blowing speedboats out of the water south of Cuba with reckless abandon.
right.
The idea that they don't know anything about, who was on this boat and what it was up to seems to strain credulity. Would you agree with that, Arnold?
Yeah, it's very difficult to believe. In addition, I'd like to add one point. According to the Cuban sources, which I think we can rely on, these 10 people on board were not innocent, a flotilla of people looking for peace or whatever. Some of them already have been on the watch list of the Cuban Ministry of Interior for trying to organize terrorist activities inside Cuba. So, I'm quite sure, as you're saying, that even though Rubio denies knowledge about it, how can they not know that this boat leaving from Miami on the way to Cuba, it ran under the radar of the United States? It's hard to believe. And in any case, one thing for sure, I mean, you mentioned Bay of Pigs. Yes, that is another type of Bay of Pigs, but what it shows that, I'm speaking to my Cuban colleagues and friends there in Havana. Cuban are very proud of it. Since the latest U.S. Offensive against Cuba, Cuba fought back, and they won that battle on February 25th against that attempt, perhaps for another Bay of Pigs. Now, this I think is very significant. What will happen in the future is hard to say.
Actually, that was where I wanted to take the conversation next. In the last several months, we've watched people like you and me who do a lot of reporting on Western imperialism in the non-Western world. Certainly, I don't know if I speak for you when I say this, but I have been dismayed at the degree to which the United States has been able to take acts of aggression, criminal violations of international law against sovereign states in Latin America with total impunity. And there hasn't appeared to be, in particularly, I'm thinking here about the kidnapping of President Maduro, meaningful military resistance to these acts of aggression. This, however, if in fact the report is accurate, would mark, I think, a turning point potentially for the attitude of targeted Latin American states. Do you think this has the potential to inspire a more militant form of resistance to Western imperialism in the region?
Yeah, well, Cuba has historically, since January 1st, 1959, has been the symbol of a country in our part of the world to stand up to U.S. imperialism, to stand up for its sovereignty, for the right to have its own political and social system. And here we are in 2026. Is history calling on Cuba once again, as you're implying, and I agree with you, to lead this offensive that is necessary, or the counteroffensive against the United States? On February 25th, it was announced that by the lawyer for President Maduro, that United States has blocked payment for him as his lawyer from Venezuela to pay for his defense. This is unheard of. It's terrible. And what is the pushback from the Latin America? It's quite weak, I would say. With regards to Nicolas Maduro, in my view, what is happening now? January 3rd was obviously a major defeat for Venezuela. At the same time, it wasn't that as easy as the United States thought, because I don't know if you saw, it was hard to watch carefully, the State of the Union address by President Trump a couple of days ago. And he let it out of the bag, the cat out of the bag. It wasn't that easy. The defense was quite solid, given the circumstances, against the U.S. aggression on January 3rd. And some of the main aggressors were seriously wounded. One of the persons actually came close to dying on the helicopter that was supposed to capture Maduro and bring him back. And he was, of course, honored, gave a special honor in the Congress during the State of the Union message. But what came through is the initial story that the United States gave. Oh, it was easy. We took them out. There was no resistance. It does not seem to be the case. There was very strong resistance. Otherwise, that individual who was leading that whole capture would not have been seriously wounded, and according to Trump himself, was close to death on that helicopter. So
Mm-hmm.
I think what happened there, and now what happened in Cuba, within 1 kilometer of Cuba's coast. Once again, I think we may see, as you're suggesting, I hope so, a reawakening of opposition to U.S. aggression in that whole area.
I want to come back to Venezuela. This is very important, obviously, what's happening there. But I just want to ask you one more question about the situation in Cuba. There have been reports over the last couple of weeks. I saw a report, I don't know whether it's accurate or not, that the Russian ambassador to Cuba said that Russia would send oil at this time of dire need. And there have been some reports in the past few days that a Chinese-owned tanker appears to be transporting Russian fuel and heading towards Cuba. And what do you make of these reports, Arnold? Do you think that the Russians or the Chinese or both can be counted upon to at least provide economic, humanitarian aid at this moment of Cuba's dire need, or do you think that's doubtful?
I follow those reports as you do. My feeling is that some of these reports are sort of a balloon floated to indirectly attack Russia and China. In other words, what people are expecting, yes, Russia and China should send very Russian particular oil to Cuba, and China send other very important aid to Cuba. So people are expecting it, but of course it doesn't happen. As far as I know, Russia is not sending oil to Cuba. But on the other hand, China, in my view, is playing a very important role in terms of developing the solar alternative to oil for Cuba. Just in the last year, I think they tripled the amount of solar panels or solar energy available to Cuba. It's now up to 20%. So I was just speaking to a Cuban friend of mine in Havana. I said, I said, hang on there. If you guys could hang on for 6 months, 1 year, whatever, all those, the important solar polar transformation as a source of energy from petrol to sun will make things very, very helpful for the Cuban resistance. I'm hopeful in the long run, but China and Russia have not done more than that.
Right. And one other BRICS country I want to mention in particular, this seems a bit far afield from Latin America, but I do think it has potential relevance to what is happening there. And that is yesterday, those of us who care about the humanity of the Palestinian people were appalled, shocked, and chagrined to see this. So one of the three main powers of the BRICS, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, went to the Knesset, was groveling before the indicted war criminal Netanyahu, received some kind of a ludicrous medal from I think the Speaker of the Knesset. And, Arnold, there's been a lot of debate in the alternative media in anti-imperialist circles about the role of the BRICS in the liberation of states that have typically been in the global south that have been targeted with Western imperialism. And I was a bit hopeful, I have just speaking for myself, over the past few years, that this might become a kind of if not the spear of the resistance to Western imperialism, at least an ally of those who were fighting to free themselves from the shackles of Western domination. And then I've been disappointed by the level of support that Venezuela has received and Cuba has received from BRICS powers. And then I see this, and I have to tell you that I've become a skeptic, not about the potential for resistance. I remain very bullish about the potential for resistance, indigenous resistance. But when it comes to counting on the BRICS countries to defend the sovereignty of states in Latin America, I've become an extreme skeptic. Now, I'm hoping you can persuade me that I shouldn't be so skeptical, but what's your view about all of this, Arnold?
I'll try to persuade you not to be so skeptical, but I understand where you're coming from. It is disappointing. At the same time, I think we have to see the multipolar world on a long-term basis. Yes, of course, perhaps we would like to see countries like members of the BRICS providing more assistance to Venezuela and Cuba. At the same time, in the long run, I'm talking in the next few years, this multipolar world, is going to help all of those who are opposing U.S. imperialism. Now, put it this way, we could look at the other side of the coin. If it was not for BRICS, if it was not for this new emerging multipolar world, things would be even worse for countries such as Cuba and Venezuela. United States has to watch their specific activities regarding Cuba and Venezuela because of BRICS, because of Russia, because of China. Even though they might not be sending as much aid as one would like, ideally, at the same time, they have many strong statements in support of the right of Cuba and Venezuela to their sovereignty. So in the long run, I am not skeptical. In fact, I am optimistic because in the long run, these BRIC countries, the multipolar world, will have the upper hand on the United States. And I don't think one should be overly critical of BRICS or the multipolar world because it is something that is new, relatively new, and it's something that's in development. And I think it's bound to develop. I remember a very important statement by Nicolas Maduro several years ago, when he said, talking about United States and Ukraine, that we are seeing the birth pangs of a new world. That was several years ago. And I think it's right. I think we're still seeing the birth pangs of a new world, which is where the multipolarity alliance such as BRICS will have the upper hand against an aggressive U.S. imperialism. Perhaps I'm overly optimistic. I don't know.
Inshallah. I'd love for you to be correct. And I do readily acknowledge that this is a long-term struggle, and there are going to be, defeats, setbacks, and victories along the way. The path to justice is not linear. In any case, let's go back to the question of Venezuela. So I was there recently, Arnold, and one of the things that I did was I interviewed a petroleum economist from the Universidad Central de Venezuela. His name is Professor Carlos Mendoza Potella, and he was imprisoned. He's a left-wing revolutionary who was imprisoned for his revolutionary activities years ago, and he later served as a Venezuelan diplomat. And what I discussed with him when I was in Caracas a couple of weeks ago was this new petroleum law adopted by Delcy Rodriguez with, it appears, and he confirmed this, virtually no opposition in the Venezuelan National Assembly. And he was very critical of this law. He said the fundamental problem with it is it constitutes a surrender of Venezuelan sovereignty over its resources. And he said that his criticisms had been entirely ignored by the government, and he was dismayed by the lack of opposition to it. And then at the same time, you see reports like this, where interim President Delcy Rodriguez is holding what appear to be friendly discussions with U.S. officials, the very same officials who violated the UN Charter by attacking Venezuela and kidnapping its president. So at the same time, I want to say that I understand the realities confronting the government of Delcy Rodriguez. They are obviously in a very difficult spot. And any sane and rational government would try to avoid the genocidal destructiveness of the US military. We've seen what it's capable of doing to resistance movements in West Asia. So she's stuck between a rock and a hard place. I completely understand that.
Right.
But at the same time, I want to be clear-eyed as a resistance journalist about what's happening there. Even if I understand the difficulties confronting her government, I want to be honest with myself and with our audience about what is happening there. Do you see these, shall we say, interactions, these courteous and friendly interactions with the Trump regime and the adoption of this new petroleum law as significant concessions and effectively, perhaps not a total abandonment of the Bolivarian revolution, but shall we say a betrayal of the Bolivarian revolution? Or do you think that we shouldn't be concerned about this?
Allow me to deal with the issue of petroleum. I don't want to go into the details of the petroleum legislation, etc., because the audience might find it a bit heavy. But this is my take on it. In 1998, Hugo Chavez won the elections. He was installed as president in 1991. And shortly after that, he made a very important statement. He came to power in 1999, the first government that came into power after the defeat of the Soviet Union and Socialist Bloc. And what he said there is very significant, that we have a special responsibility in Venezuela, being the first country to come into power after the defeat of the Socialist Bloc. And thus, what we have to do, we are the spearhead of a new movement based on a non-dogmatic approach to the issue of natural resources. I think that is really important. I think that is what right from the beginning that Chavismo has been able to do. That on the one hand, well, as you know, they came to power, they did not overthrow the old system. The capitalists were still there. Many of the oil oligarchs were still there. What they had to do, they had to manage an economy that was mixed right from the beginning. Not because they wanted that way, they were confronted with that situation. And therefore, I think that to see the current situation with regards to petroleum, new laws, one has to see it as part of the overall new scenario that came in after 1991, in which the issue of a mixed economy is something that had to be dealt with. Now, with regards to what was the other question? I'm sorry.
Well, if you think that this is maybe abandonment is too strong a word, but a resiling from the Bolivarian revolution, or do you think that this is more superficial than substantive? These reforms to the petroleum law and these friendly discussions with the United States or the Trump regime.
I think that they're relatively secondary because, as I mentioned right from the beginning, Chavismo had to deal with a mixed economy, and they're still dealing with a mixed economy now. Now, what happened on January 3rd, one cannot deny it was a major defeat for Chavismo. And Delcy Rodriguez has to deal with it. I mean, she can't she can't take an offensive attitude toward the United States and risk being bombed again. So I think, in my view, how do we evaluate what Delcy Rodriguez is doing, whether it's justified or not? My take on it is the following: how come those who oppose Chavismo, they are speaking in the name of Hugo Chavez against Delcy Rodriguez, saying that she betrayed Maduro, that she betrayed the tradition of Chavez? I don't believe so. I believe, in my view, I hope I'm right, that she has to deal with a very difficult situation. Very few countries in the world over the last 10, 20 years have had to deal with such a difficult situation as Venezuela has been faced since January 3rd of 2026. And I think she's quite open. When she met with the head of the CIA, which you just showed us, she said, it was very painful for me. I had to meet with that person who was the head of the organization, the CIA, who's responsible for the killing and the torture of my father. Because Delcy Rodriguez's father as Jorge Rodriguez's father as well, was part of that revolutionary movement that gave rise to Chavismo later on, and they were assassinated by the CIA. So she was quite frank. It's painful for me to sit in front of them, but what other choice does she have? She has to negotiate a situation. But I think in the long run, we will see that this tactical option that Venezuela is adopting is the right one. They have no other choice, and I think time is on their side because what will happen. For example, it's interesting. I'm very interested in the trial that's going to take place in New York in the next couple of months. It is quite possible that we have some kind of a surprise. Like what will he has a Maduro has a very good lawyer, whether he's paid or not. He was the one who defended Julian Assange. Now, what happens if the judge finds that it was illegal what the United States did against Maduro as a head of state? He should be have you know more about this than I do as an international lawyer. He should be given immunity and not be persecuted in the courts. So time is on our side. We will see what happened in that trial. It's not. I don't think it's an accident. The United States is trying to block Venezuela from paying his lawyer so as to defend him properly. So Delcy Rodriguez and Jorge Rodriguez and the others who are in power now, they still may proven to be correct in uh, uh, their tactical option to how they deal with the latest offensive by the United States against them.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Arnold. I have read the indictment against President Maduro,
You
and
have you
although
have
I have read it, uh,
okay. So
and I'm not a criminal lawyer. I do civil litigation, but my take on it is that even if the judge decides that President Maduro was lawfully apprehended and that the court has the jurisdiction to adjudicate these claims, it's possible that President Maduro will be acquitted because the indictment. I mean, I don't know what evidence they're going to put to the court at this stage. I don't think anybody really knows outside of the Department of Justice, but just based on the indictment, it seems to me to be an extraordinarily flimsy set of accusations against President Maduro. I think they're going to have a difficulty proving it. Now, at the same time, I don't think that any Venezuelan president who is anti-imperialist is going to get a sympathetic hearing from a U.S. court. But U.S. courts can surprise you. So I certainly don't exclude the possibility that he will be acquitted. Now, to close out our conversation, I'd like to shift over to Mexico,
sure.
where there has been, another quite dramatic development in the killing of what I understand to be the most powerful of the Mexican drug lords by Mexican security forces. His name he is known as El Mencho, and this apparently caused a significant amount of unrest I believe, in Guadalajara. But in any case, I saw President Sheinbaum of Mexico acknowledge publicly that this operation was carried out with the benefit of intelligence from the U.S. government, provided by the U.S. government. Now, my vague recollection, I was speaking with a Mexican analyst a few months ago, is that President Sheinbaum's predecessor, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, had a not necessarily a conciliatory approach to the drug lords, but he was trying to resolve the problem of interdiction of drugs to the degree that he could in a nonviolent manner. And this seems to be this killing, especially the acknowledgement that it was done with the benefit of U.S. intelligence. It seems to be a kind of concession to the Trump regime, because the Trump regime has been demanding that the Mexican government take a much more forceful approach to the drug trade. What do you make of all of this? Do you think that this is similar to what is going on in Venezuela, which is to say that Claudia Sheinbaum is trying to manage a very difficult situation, and the reason why she took this provocative step was to placate Trump? Or do you think something else is going on?
No, I think you're right. Both in the case of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, and now Sheinbaum, Mexico, both are in very difficult situations. I would not, in my view, I would not condemn either of them or even criticize either of them for as someone as political personalities who are making concessions to the United States. there has to be some kind of give and take in a current situation where the United States is on the offensive against countries such as Venezuela and Cuba, and very little pushback from countries in Latin America. For example, Brazil. Where's Brazil in all this? Or Colombia, pretty good, but perhaps it could be better. So I don't think they are, in both cases, Venezuela and Mexico, I do not think they're concessions in terms of principle. They may be concession in terms of tactics, but who can blame them? They're facing a very rabid empire who are encouraged by the fact there's very little pushback from Latin America. And I think that this is, like uh, Cuba has given so much to Latin America, for example, the Caribbean. And just on February 25th, the Honduras government told the Cuban, told the Cuban medical team in Honduras to go back and to stop the giving of free medical aid to the Honduran people. And we see scenes of the people in Honduras crying, begging them not to leave because they so much appreciate the Cuban contribution to the health system in Honduras. So this is the situation we're dealing with. We have a country such as Honduras who does not have the guts to stand up to the United States just on a simple thing of humanitarian medical aid, which Cuba has been offering to Honduras and countries in the Caribbean.
Mm. Before I let you go, I can't help but ask you one final question,
Go
Arnold.
ahead.
It's uh, a poll that I've been talking about a lot over the last few days, just done by Nanos Research. You and I are both in Montreal. We're both Canadians. And this poll done by Nanos the end of January, early February found that 55% of Canadians think that the United States is the greatest threat to Canada's security at this time. Only 15% thought it was China. Only 14% thought it was Russia. So together, China and Russia accounted for 29%, which was, approximately half of the number who thought that the U.S. is the greatest threat. And you can also see there that Iran barely registers, and of course Venezuela or Cuba are nowhere to be seen on this chart. I just throw it over to you. What do you make of the public sentiment in the country right now, and how do you? Please talk to us also about the discrepancy between these numbers and what we hear from the corporate media in this country about national security.
Well, thanks. I'm glad that you're raising this issue. I've been thinking about it and meditating on this issue of anti-U.S. imperialism in Canada over many years. Like living in the country as you, I feel the sentiment of the people of Canada against U.S. imperialism. There's a definite hatred, an ingrown hatred against the United States. I had this feeling over the last few years, and I read a very important book. I would recommend it. It's by J.L. Granstein. It's the title of the book, Yankee Go Home, with a question mark. Now, this book was written not by a leftist, not by a radical or whatever. It was written by a pro-British, anti-U.S. imperialist historian. And in that book, it's very interesting. He goes through the history of Canada, how there have been ups and downs with regards to anti-imperialism. As he said, Yankee Go Home. And what is very interesting to note in that very detailed account, that throughout the years, as he himself said, anti Americanism is like a state religion in Canada. I agree with him that it is sort of a state religion in Canada. I don't know if you have the same feeling as someone living and working in Canada, but I think it's very strong. And I think that what is important that now is that the sentiment, he was wrong in his conclusion. He says this Canada anti-Americanism as a state religion, forget about it. It's all over. It's not all over. Thanks to Donald Trump, the anti-U.S. imperialism as a state religion, as he said it, is stronger than ever. We see it. We see it in everything in terms of the results of the hockey, the Olympics, and whatever. I think, to respond to your question, that anti-U.S. imperialism, and that is an accurate assessment by that article that you just showed on your screen, is increasing. It's going to increase in the coming days and years. I don't think that even if Trump is replaced in a couple of years, I do not think it'll go down. I think that it's ingrained in the Canadian people to have a sentiment against the United States. And it's very good. Countries such as China are seen in a more positive light regarding, in comparison to the United States. I think it's very positive for the economic and political relationship in Canada and other countries such as China.
Right. I imagine you would agree with me that the real object of Canadians' ire right now is not sort of ordinary American citizens, but it's the government,
Yeah,
which to a very large degree does not represent the people of the United States. It represents some, but many do not feel represented. Uh,
agreed.
we always want to point out on this program our feelings of solidarity to ordinary Americans, in particular those who are being oppressed by their own government.
Yeah, I personally have very strong, long-standing feelings of solidarity with the American people going back to the 1960s when we have draft dodgers from the United States coming to Canada to seek shelter from the persecution of the U.S. war machine. So I fully agree with you. Our sentiment is against the American government and not against the American people, on the contrary.
Thank you very much, Arnold. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you, and I hope we can do this again soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me once again.
And we're signing off from Montreal on February 26, 2026.